The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Yesterday, early afternoon, by the way, Lewis joining me at the desk today. It's weird having you sitting over here, Lewis, but here you are.
It's weird to be here.
I was having a conversation with my dad on the phone. We were talking about Brexit. I was telling him I was looking at flights for upcoming vacations and how it was very interesting that now with Turkish Airlines setting up Istanbul airport as a sort of gateway to all of Europe and much of Asia, you can basically fly from Boston to anywhere in Europe for $600 in the next few months, going through Istanbul. And my dad said, yeah, that is true, but you know, attacks can happen anywhere, but they have happened recently at Istanbul airport. And indeed, just hours after that phone call with my dad, we learned that 3 attackers detonated bombs and opened fire at the Istanbul airport yesterday. At minimum, 41 people were killed. Dozens and dozens, one estimate at 147, one estimate over 200 in terms of the number wounded. And the long story short of the attack is that 2 gunmen opened fire with automatic weapons at a security checkpoint outside the airport, then detonated their explosives. Meanwhile, a 3rd attacker set off explosive in the parking lot. Most of the dead are Turks, although some foreigners. As I mentioned, this airport increasingly a sort of gateway to much of the world. Some foreigners also killed. Flights out of Istanbul airport immediately canceled last night. Ones on their way were diverted. This is the 3rd busiest airport in Europe and the 11th busiest in the world. Who did it? Initially, both the Islamic State and Kurdish militants were being considered as possible perpetrators. A few hours later, the Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim said that indications point to the Islamic State. But why? What about the timing and the circumstances and the specifics point to ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, call them what you will? One hypothesis suggests that the recent reconciliation between Turkey and Israel might have angered ISIL militants. Israel and Turkey announced a pretty significant deal to restore diplomatic relations. This is a really positive step after 6 years of estrangement. And Mustafa Akyol, a prominent Turkish columnist, wrote yesterday on Twitter, quote, "The fact that the attack came right after the Turkish-Israeli deal might not be an accident if ISIS is that fast in response." The terrorists arrived at the airport in a taxi, according to Turkish Prime Minister Yildirim, who said more details would be shared later. As of this morning, Lewis, still nobody has claimed responsibility of the attack. To be clear, there have been other attacks in Turkey over the last year or two where no one ultimately claimed responsibility, but they are believed to have been perpetrated by ISIL.
Yeah, usually when it is a suicide bomber, it tends to be someone from these extremist religious groups, and then when it's a bomb that detonates without it being attached to someone, well, more likely in that case to be the Kurds, which are kind of battling the Turks, and it's a messy situation.
For those saying, obviously it was ISIL, Turkey is, as Lewis sort of alluded to, simultaneously facing threats from both ISIL and Kurdish militants who are fighting a war against the Turkish state in the southeast of Turkey. And for example, back in February, a car bombing was attributed to Kurdish militants, as Lewis astutely suggesting there, an explosion not on the body of an individual person. And as a sort of big picture reminder, Turkey is a NATO ally. It really was once a safe haven of stability in the Middle East, increasingly a hub of chaos and violence more recently. Istanbul airport, a real hub in the area. And interesting, Lewis, that there was two of these individuals detonating their explosives at a checkpoint outside the airport, similar to how security is done at Tel Aviv, at least in that element, and certainly something we talk about, how you can go right up to the security line at most American airports without having passed through any screening.
Yeah, it's a problem. It was pre-security. They knew they wouldn't get through security with their devices, and they didn't plan to. It's a crazy airport. I've been there multiple times. Yeah. There are crowds everywhere. And how far out do you go? You know, how far out does the security go? How can you really prevent things like this from happening at an airport of that size.
Right. Definitive, and when we talk about it's the same thing as why pass a law when it wouldn't prevent anybody. There are some people that will not be affected or prevented from doing X by that law. When we talk about security measures, yes, it is very difficult to get everybody, but if you have these sort of concentric circles of security, you can at least, in most cases, deter some people and also reduce the damage that is done. Here, significant damage done regardless. Convicted shoplifter and notorious Trump spokesperson Katrina Pierson went on CNN to try to explain that doggone Muslim ban that we've all heard about from Donald Trump many times now, but still fail to understand the specifics of. It did not go well at all. Trump has talked about how he will put the best people around him, and he keeps falling flat on that promise. This is yet another press spokesperson who can't seem to put together even a remotely coherent explanation of anything Trump is proposing to do. So I've got video I'm going to play for you. Katrina Pierson goes on CNN. She tries to sidestep every question about the Muslim ban. And really, how can we expect Katrina Pierson to understand the Muslim ban when it's not even clear Trump understands his own plan? Let's take a look at the first attempt at answering the question.
If you never knew what the ban was to begin with, I know the news media has been reporting that the initial ban was against all Muslims, and that simply was not the case. It was simply for Muslim immigration, and Mr. Trump is simply adding specifics to clarify what his position is, as opposed to what the media has been reporting what it is. There has been no change to this. Mr. Trump still wants to stop individuals from coming into this country who cannot be vetted.
All right, I think we actually have the sound bite of one of his initial
okay, so I think we actually,
of the ban.
that should have been the end of that,
is that right, David?
first clip.
All right, let's
there.
listen to that.
There we go. So, okay, now she didn't mention the word Muslim at all, right? She just didn't mention it. We're talking about stopping individuals. So then there's follow-up on that. Let's now take a look at the next piece of this nonsense.
Muslims, and so now he's not going to characterize it as Muslims? Immigrants, and I'm talking about immigrants. You say it's about immigration. I'm talking about immigration. I'm talking about visitors coming to the country.
Well, right, but the initial reports were all Muslims, even extending it to American Muslims, which didn't make any sense. And we can go back to that footage and look. This had nothing to do with American Muslims, or even soldiers for that matter. But Mr. Trump is going to be refining his policy, putting out more specific details, which everyone's been asking for. But there has been no change. He still does not want to allow individuals to come into this country who cannot be vetted.
Individuals or Muslims?
Well, it doesn't matter really where you're coming from, except for the fact of the terrorist nations, which is something that he is adding to this policy to make it more clear.
I love it. It doesn't make any difference where you're coming from, unless you're coming from a terrorist nation. So it does make a difference where you're coming from, right? And then she goes into this total straw man where she says, Mr. Trump never was talking about banning American Muslims from traveling to the U.S. Well, no, why would he? They're American, and they're already in the U.S. I mean, just totally incoherent. And then she ends with this thing. It's about individuals who can't be vetted. No mention of Muslims at all. But then there's a follow-up and she says, well, yes, other than if they're individuals from these hostile nations, which, by the way, are only Muslim. And here we have the next attempt here. It's just horrendous.
Adding to this policy to make it more clear that if you are coming from a hostile nation and you cannot be vetted, absolutely you should not come into this country. But individuals are the same. We cannot allow individuals to come into this country that cannot be vetted.
Okay, but you're talking about terrorist countries, and what we've seen is individuals who are from Belgium, who are from France. I mean, So
that's a great question, right? The Belgium and France question. We just can't get a list of countries, and there's still this back and forth. It doesn't matter what your religion is. We want to vet individuals from hostile nations, which are the Muslim ones, unless it's a country like Belgium and France, where we have seen Muslim terror, but those aren't state-sponsored. And then I believe this is going to be, we have two more of these attempts, and it just gets worse and worse.
I mean, those you wouldn't
That's the point.
So you're talking about, so explain who is not allowed in and what countries we're talking about, and also how you're dealing, I mean, in this latest
An individual that cannot be vetted. As we know, ISIS has exploited passport systems in some of these countries. The individual that came in on the K-1 visa, they didn't even know where she was from initially. If you cannot be vetted, you should not be allowed into this country. And I think that speaks volumes. If we are allowing people into this country where we do not know their intentions, we do not know where they're from, and if they're coming from hostile territories, that is extremely dangerous right now.
How is it not a change if before he was talking about Muslim immigrants, and now you're saying individuals, and the reporting that we have coming from Gloria?
So we have a bunch more clips, but it just goes on like this for a while. We don't need to play anymore. So basically, it's partially Muslims unless you can't be vetted, but location doesn't matter unless it's a hostile location, which we won't name which ones qualify, but religion is not a factor, and this isn't a change unless you're Muslim. I get it, Lewis. Perfectly clear, isn't it?
Well, Donald Trump's whole thing is, I know how to do everything, and I'll tell you all about it once I'm in office. And this is kind of... it's kind of like, you need me, I'm going to fearmonger, you need me to protect you, so vote me in. That's the whole thing.
At least get a coherent press representative up there. We'll take a break. Big show coming up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Douglas Brown. Douglas, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. You can sign up, vote with your dollars, support independent media at davidpakman.com/membership. We are getting dangerously close to the launch of the all-new David Pakman Show website and membership portal. It's going to be an incredible thing. And remember, if you ever shop on Amazon.com, you can also go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop. Then any shopping you do will support the David Pakman Show. Let's get into Hatriot Mail for the week. It is special this week.
Hey, let's face it, we're only a couple of blood moons away from a total homo-fascist takeover. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So we're going back. We've had very specific political critiques of me, of Lewis, of the show, whatever, for several weeks now, very campaign oriented. We're going back to really the early days of Hatriot Mail with this week's Hatriot Mail. Take a listen to this.
David Pakman is a little prick that thinks he's clever, but really just an arrogant douche. He and his butt-ugly boyfriend should get back to community college and do their stupid little show there.
So one thing is the going back to Lewis and I are not only gay, but we are gay together. We're in a relationship together. But the underlying thing to that is that it would be objectively bad if it were true, right? Like the show would be invalid in terms of the opinion if we were gay. That's the underlying thing. The thing about, oh, that person's gay, that person's straight, yeah, whatever. But why would the show be worse if the hosts were gay?
Well, that's something you'd have to ask a Hatriot. There's also the community college / your mom's basement theme, which goes back to the roots of Hatriot Mail.
We've been out of my mom's basement for months on this show. That's an unfair attack. There is this story which I'll tell because, Rachel, I assume you haven't heard the story. We once received an email from someone who said, in fact, it was a guy out in Boston who wrote to me and said, hey, David, I really love what you and Lewis are doing on the show, and it would just be fantastic if you're ever in Boston. My husband and I, this was a gay man, we would love to take you guys to dinner and just sort of chat, whatever. And it all seemed sort of, nothing unusual about it at all. And I wrote back and I said, oh yeah, I don't know of any time we're going to be in Boston soon, sometimes, but I must have responded in a way that encouraged another response. And the guy wrote back and it was very clear he was inviting Lewis and I on a double date. And the idea was he and his husband wanted to take Lewis and me as a couple out to sort of like a double date scenario. And, I responded and I said, oh, I'm getting the sense that this is a sort of double date scenario. Just so you know, not only are Lewis and I not together, both of us date women exclusively at this point, at least in our lives. Who knows in the future what could happen with anybody, but at this point, that's what we're doing. And the guy was sort of embarrassed or whatever. But when I told friends about it, they said, you should have agreed to the dinner without telling Lewis that the understanding was that you guys were a couple. Then we would have showed up. How soon do you think Lewis would have figured out what was going on?
I think almost instantly, within moments.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
All right. So anyway, Hatriot Mail, going back to when all else fails, go back to rampant homophobia. Okay, even the top Senate Republican, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, is refusing to say that Donald Trump, his party's presumptive nominee, is qualified to be president. He was interviewed over the weekend by George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week. He was asked, Trump gave this disastrous press conference in Scotland. His poll numbers are falling off of a cliff. And McConnell refused to even say that his party's nominee, presumptive nominee, is qualified to be president. Here's a little video and audio for you. It's pretty pathetic.
Just heard those new poll numbers. 64% of Americans say they don't think that Donald Trump is qualified to be president. Do you believe he's qualified? And how do you convince all those voters who think he isn't?
Right.
Well, look, I think there's no question that he's made a number of mistakes over the last few weeks. I think they're beginning to right the ship. It's a long time until November, and the burden obviously will be on him to convince people that he can handle this job. And I think a good step in the right direction was the changes he made in the campaign. He's beginning to use a prepared script more often, which I think is absolutely appropriate for any candidate, whether you're a longtime politician like Hillary Clinton or whether you're new to the game like Donald Trump.
I didn't hear you say whether you thought he was qualified.
Look, that'll be up to the American people to decide. He won the Republican nomination fair and square. He got more votes than anybody else against a whole lot of well-qualified candidates. And so our primary voters have made their decision as to who they want to be the nominee.
So is your party's candidate qualified? He has made mistakes. He's righting the ship. There's a long time left until the election actually happens. It's his responsibility to convince people that he can handle being president. Using a teleprompter is a good idea. The American people are going to have to decide he didn't cheat his way to the nomination. Where was there even a hint there that Mitch McConnell thinks Trump is even slightly qualified for this position? I mean, not even alluding to that.
Well, the best part is that he called everyone Trump ran against as well qualified. He referred to them as well qualified. And yet he cannot say that Trump is.
That's the amazing thing. I mean, Rachel, who were those qualified candidates that Trump ran against? Is it certainly not Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, and Marco Rubio, or Carly Fiorina, or Mike Huckabee, or Rick Santorum, or Rick Perry? I guess in some sense, based on resume, Bush, Kasich, and Chris Christie were somewhat better. But how can he say every single person he ran against was qualified? But he still can't say Trump is qualified.
He can't, but he kind of dug himself into a bigger hole because he also admitted that he needs to be able to compete financially because he had about $1.3 million in cash on hand at the end of his last reporting period. So he kind of also further agreed, well, he has to catch up and catch up fast. So yeah.
So on top of it, in this ringing endorsement of his party's nominee, saying he also has no money with which to even run a campaign. A better question, I think, is whether Mitch McConnell is qualified to figure out who is qualified to be president. The answer is pretty clearly no when he says not that Trump is qualified, but that all of the people he ran against were qualified. Big picture, just real problems within the Republican Party. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. An ongoing story in terms of the Republican Party is the growing list of Republicans who will not support, who will not endorse, who will not vote for Donald Trump, the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party. And the new thing is that Republicans of varying levels of notoriety are leaving the Republican Party altogether over Donald Trump. So I think that there's a sort of tier, Lewis, where tier one would be, I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote for Trump, but I don't like it. And then tier two is, I'm a Republican, and I'm not going to vote for Trump, but I will remain a Republican. And tier three, which is what I call going nuclear in some sense, is I am leaving the Republican Party because Donald Trump is the nominee. George Will, the well-known conservative writer George Will, is no longer a Republican. He revealed this last week in a meeting with the Federalist Society where he said, quote, I changed my registration to unaffiliated 23 days ago. I hardly made an announcement. I just mentioned this in a meeting with the Federalist Society. I left for the same reason I joined in 1964 when I voted for Barry Goldwater. I joined it because I was a conservative, but I will leave for the same reason that I'm a conservative and Donald Trump does not represent that. saying after Trump went after the Mexican judge from northern Indiana, then Paul Ryan endorsed him, and I decided that, in fact, this is not my party anymore. What did Trump do? Insulted George Will, saying he's an overrated political pundit who lost his way a long time ago and has left the Republican Party after making many bad calls. And then we have Iowa State Senator David Johnson, who also is no longer a Republican, saying, I am a Republican at heart, but I don't think it's enough to say I disagree with Mr. Trump or I find him offensive or whatever. And then a growing list of Republicans who just aren't going to the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio at all. Congressman Trey Gowdy, I am not attending. Mark Sanford, Republican from South Carolina, I'm not, meaning I'm not attending the Republican convention. Congressman Carlos Curbelo from Florida, I won't be there. And Congresswoman Mia Love from Utah, who's been seen as a potential vice presidential contender, saying to Politico she is going to skip the convention because she sees no upsides. This doesn't practically change the political beliefs of anybody, right? George Will and David Johnson, whoever else, they still hold the same positions, but they are so repulsed by what is going on with Donald Trump that they are no longer part of that party. Where are they going? I guess to Independentville. I don't know. But very, very unique circumstances this year.
It is. I don't understand why it takes Donald Trump to push these people out of the party.
Right.
The party has been completely repulsive and disgusting and abhorrent for decades. And if Donald Trump's rhetoric and support for Donald Trump is the deciding factor for you, you just haven't been paying attention.
And the sort of overarching themes of the Trump presidency, presidential campaign, Rachel, are authoritarianism and incompetence. But in reality, Trump has moderate beliefs. He has some beliefs that are more common among the left. He ended up in the Republican Party because there's no other path for him. Trump would never have been the Democratic nominee. So it's interesting that these people are leaving the Republican Party because of Trump, but Trump is only in the Republican primary because of convenience and that there's no other path for him.
Well, I think there's a distinction between people who are saying that, oh, I'm going to not endorse him because he's not a real conservative, such as Lionel Sosa, the Texas-based ad manager. But in terms of people saying he's callousness and extremist and racism, there is a difference between people who want to kind of disown him for saying that he's not a real conservative because of his kind of brash personality versus actually being kind of moderate.
Yeah, right. So you might say Trump as a personality is offensive, and thus I'm leaving the Republican Party. That is different than saying Trump's policy positions don't reflect mine, and now that he's the Republican nominee, there's clearly no place for my views in the Republican Party. Those are very different circumstances under which someone might distance themselves from the party.
Right. And if I had to guess, I'd say we're talking about people who will very quickly rejoin the party once Donald Trump is out of the picture and there are more realistic candidates. Or realistic. What's realistic at this point?
Be that, and your microphone is, of course, on, right? For sure.
My microphone is on, Dave.
Okay, good. Sometimes I
don't know
feel
why
like
you have such trouble hearing.
Yeah, I think I'm having a hearing issue.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
Well,
I'll get that checked after the show. For now, we will keep an eye on the Republican race. We will take a break, and we've got a great interview coming up. Make sure to give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Evan Fraser, who's a Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and a professor of geography at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. Evan, I have so much I want to ask you about. Let's start sort of more generally with food security and food supply. How scared or cautious is realistic to be about how quickly an interruption to the food supply would affect end users who are used to just going to the grocery store and buying food whenever it is that they're hungry or want to buy food?
So that's a great question, David. On one level, things ought to be concerning to us. If you think of how much food, say, we have in a city, there's really not that much. And so if we imagined anything stopping our ability to import food, things could unravel pretty quickly. And we've got cases like Hurricane Katrina, where people ran out of products very, very quickly. So often we say we've got about 3 days of food in a city. Or about 10 years, a little more than 10 years ago, there was a truck driver strike in the UK that caused mass panicked buying on the supermarkets. And people were really concerned that things were going to unravel pretty fast. On the other side of the coin, when you actually look at situations where you've got, say, food riots erupting in the streets, say in Venezuela today, or in Haiti in 2008, or in Cameroon in 2008, you actually don't see much of it's actually, most of those food riots aren't caused by running out of food. It's caused often because food prices become volatile, and that exposes other things going wrong, like political corruption or urban unemployment. And what looks like a food riot actually is a protest about other political and economic things.
You mentioned 3 days, and that's interesting because earlier this week we interviewed a survival expert, and we asked him sort of about, there's sort of a range in terms of how prepared people sometimes are with regard to food or other supplies for emergencies. Some people are totally unprepared, and then you have sometimes influenced by religion. We know Mormons like to do prepping, but you have like extreme prepping. You might have up to a year of non-perishable food ready. And the survival expert, Thomas Coyne, said, listen, the way I work is I suggest people plan for scenarios that have happened before. We can all imagine so-called worst-case scenarios, but 72 hours was what he said. And you're talking about that we seem to have about a 3-day food supply before interruptions would be noticeable. So is there something to that, to this 3-day idea?
So I don't honestly know. That becomes an analytic question, and I don't know if anybody has actually done the research to say if you've got a major disruption in the food system, if you've got 3 days of supplies, does stability remain? I don't. That's an experimental question that I don't think anyone's tested. I say 3 days because there was a journalist number of years ago now that said civilization is 9 meals away from anarchy, or 3 days, and that was a comment that was picked up by a British politician in the wake of the truck driver strike in the UK, that I mentioned a minute ago, that happened about 10 years ago. And this notion that we are 9 meals from anarchy is kind of like a nice convenient meme. As a rule of thumb, it makes sense to me. I think that most of our major services would probably come back on within 72 hours, or at least society would mobilize, a developed society anyways, would mobilize a response within 72 hours.
So let's talk a little bit about worldwide food production and sort of how it relates in a way that is either logical or not logical when compared to what we know to be relatively healthy diets. In other words, to phrase it a different way, is the world producing foods sort of in parity or concert with what we know to be relatively healthy diets?
So, David, another super question. There's a bunch of ways you can answer that. At a really crude level, you can just measure the calories available on the planet. And if you imagine perfect distribution, we actually have more than enough. According to the United Nations statistics, there's about 2,850 calories available per person per day. So that's tons. Most of us on average should eat about 2,200 or 2,300, depending on our age, our gender, and our level of activity. So there's lots at a calorie level, but way too many of those calories at a global level are cereals, our sugars, or our fats. And we really overproduce those kinds of foods. Whereas if you think of those 8 to 10 servings of fruit and veg a day, there simply isn't enough fruit and vegetable for us all to eat a nutritious diet. And work that I've been doing just today, I was working on this data, is when you go through global production data and you convert those tons of carrots and kilograms of lettuce that we produce into servings, there's actually only about 3 servings of vegetable and fruit per person per day on the planet. So we're really underproducing fruits and vegetables. And as a result, we see that there's a mismatch between what we're producing and what we know we need to be eating. And that mismatch sort of sits at the foundation or at the basis of this worldwide epidemic we have about obesity and type 2 diabetes and people being overweight.
So let's go back to that first sort of crude number you gave us, which is 2,800 or so calories per person being produced per day. On average, 2,200 to 2,300 calories of consumption. That, to me, sort of confirms, although maybe not distributed amongst the right foods, as you mentioned, but it sort of confirms all of the reports I've read which say that hunger in the world is fundamentally a distribution and resource allocation issue. When you consider how much food is thrown out at supermarkets, when you consider food waste in the average home, in developed countries, etc. Is that your sense? I mean, is hunger on our planet fundamentally an issue of lack of political will to fix it and distribution and allocation, or is there more to it?
So, in my opinion, hunger today is not an issue of production, and I don't see a scenario in the future where hunger really results from underproduction. Hunger is a result, as you just said, David, as a result of distribution and politics. I would also add infrastructure in there. So if you imagine, say, a female farmer on a rural hillside in Malawi, actually taking the food they produce and getting it to market or storing it for long enough to be able to, without it going bad, those sort of basic infrastructure and access to market issues are very significant in causing hunger amongst the bottom billion, the poorest billion people on the planet. I mean, the World Health Organization just recently updated its statistics on hunger and nutrition, and they now figure that there's close to 1.9 billion overweight or obese people on the planet using a body mass index calculation, where according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, there's about 800 million who remain mired in undernutrition. So we live in a world of stuffed and starved, and really production is not going to change that. Increasing production isn't going to change that.
Okay, a couple other things I want to touch on with you, and really there's so much we could discuss. I want to get to your thoughts on another possible Dust Bowl, but before we do that, the documentary film Cowspiracy recently has created what many feel is a sort of overdue conversation about the connection between the raising of meat for human consumption and climate change and emissions. And Cowspiracy went even further to say not only is this an issue, but there's actually a sort of conspiracy or collusion among spanning both governments and big food to actually not talk about that so that maybe people don't realize it or action isn't taken about it. I know you've written about emissions in agriculture. What is a sort of balanced and nuanced view on the issue of meat, but more generally of emissions and raising of other types of food as well, including produce?
So the general rule of thumb is that agriculture causes about a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. A major component of that is actually land use change, so cutting forests down and plowing them for soybeans. And that's probably the single biggest contributor that the agri-food system gives to greenhouse gas emissions. The second would be livestock production, and in particular, ruminant animals, so cows, which would be the most numerous, but also sheep. And the reason for that is they have these ruminant digestive systems that involve chewing and swallowing, and then spitting back up the cud and keeping on chewing, and that system creates a lot of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas emission. So I would agree with the cow conspiracy argument, in as much as we have to acknowledge that a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is our livestock system, and a major contributor of our livestock are the ruminants and the beef. And I say this as someone who loves steak and ice cream, so I don't take any pleasure in reporting these analyses, but this is what the analysis says. Moving into the future, if we imagine a world where we put a price on carbon, whether that's a carbon tax or a cap and trade system or whatever, we imagine some sort of mechanism to put a price on carbon. It will have the effect of raising the price of ruminant animals, so beef prices, dairy will go up to consumers. And we know from consumer studies that consumers are quite elastic in terms of when prices rise for one category of protein, they'll quickly shift to another. And there's such a big drop when you go to aquaculture and poultry and eggs, and then there's a huge drop in greenhouse gas emissions when you go to, say, legumes and vegetable-based proteins. So my guess is, if we imagine this future, which I don't think is that radical, where we start paying a price for carbon, that will create strong opportunities in the market for food processors, food scientists to start experimenting more with meat substitutes. And it might not be it won't be a complete cutting off of meat, but it will be things like putting soybeans into ground beef to make mixed soybean beef burgers. And I've got a group of students that are doing things like that. And you can reduce the content of a burger, the beef content of a burger, without now affecting much in the way of taste or the consumer's enjoyment of it. And my prediction is that as we move forward into a world where we start paying for the price of our climate change through a carbon tax or something like that, we will see greater innovation at the low carbon end of the protein spectrum, and we'll see things like mixtures of soybeans and legumes in our beef burgers and in our chicken nuggets and stuff like that.
Last thing, and I wish I had more time for this. We don't, but I do want to get just your quick thoughts on it so our audience can research more if they're interested. What is a Dust Bowl, and why are you worried about another one?
So the Dust Bowl happened in the U.S. in the 1930s when two bad things happened. One, a bottoming out of the economic system in the Great Depression, and a big bad drought that affected millions of hectares of land in the American Midwest. And the confluence of that sort of perfect storm of economic and environmental problems triggered mass migration and serious unrest across the U.S. And you have to see both the Depression and the drought as part of the same narrative. Or part of the same story. So that's the concern. Can we see a return to that? And if we think of a future where the economic system is not stable in large parts of the world, and where the environment isn't stable in large parts of the world, we could see a re-emergence of that kind of confluence, where you've got no economic alternatives for poor farmers, so they farm the land harder, which means they're more vulnerable to drought. So when the drought comes, the land blows away and they're left with nothing. And I can imagine parts of the world where that kind of scenario could play out again. Will it happen in the American Midwest? My guess is no. The farming practices are different. The safety nets are different. Technology is completely different. So am I worried about the Midwest blowing away again and hundreds of thousands of refugees from Iowa walking to California? I don't think that's a realistic scenario.
No, at minimum, they wouldn't be walking to California. That we could say with some certainty. Evan Fraser, professor of geography at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. Appreciate the call.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, I anticipate significant hate mail for this story. There is a new Reuters Ipsos poll which confirms the stereotype around racial attitudes and Donald Trump supporters. It is indeed true that Trump supporters are more likely to have racist beliefs, negative beliefs about, for example, black people than other voters. Supporters of presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump are more likely to describe African Americans as criminal, not intelligent, lazy, and violent than voters who backed some Republican rivals, as well as voters who support presumptive Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. The poll also showed that a significant number of Americans in both parties view black people more negatively than whites, harbor anxiety about living in diverse neighborhoods, and are concerned that affirmative action policies discriminate against whites. But these views, not surprisingly, are more prevalent among Trump voters. We're going to break this down, but first let's just go around. Are you surprised by these results, Lewis?
Not at all.
Rachel, are you surprised by these results?
I can't say that I am.
Okay, so let's look at an example here. 16,000 Americans were interviewed, 21 questions about attitudes on race. First, intelligence. Among supporters of Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and John Kasich, Trump supporters are 50% more likely than the average to believe black people are inherently less intelligent than white people. So the average was 22.5% of respondents believe black people are just fundamentally less intelligent than white people. Donald Trump, and let's put that back on just for a second, Donald Trump supporters believe at a 33% rate that black people are less intelligent than white people, meaning it is 50% more likely that a Trump supporter believes the intelligence of black people to be lesser than that of white people. Now, comparatively, Hillary Clinton supporters believe blacks are less intelligent at roughly the average of all respondents, right around 22%. By the way, no huge victory for Hillary Clinton, right? That she can say, listen, Only 1 out of 5 of my supporters believe black people are fundamentally less intelligent than white people. How about work ethic and laziness? Let's look at those numbers. If you look at the average, on average, 26% of respondents believe that black people are fundamentally more lazy than white people. Among Trump voters, that number jumps to 40%, about 60 or 65% more likely that if you're a Trump supporter, you believe black people are fundamentally lazy. And then, of course, violence. On the issue of violence, on average, 32% of respondents believe that black people are more violent than whites. Again, nothing to cheer about, nothing to write home about, but nearly 50% of Donald Trump supporters believe that black people are fundamentally more violent than white people. So what can we gather from this, Lewis? Number one, there is absolutely no surprise that the Trump voters harbor fundamentally negative views about black people based on their blackness when compared to other groups. Also interesting that Clinton and Kasich supporters seem to be the least racist against blacks. I don't find that surprising at all if you look at the sort of rhetoric and policy positions of their campaigns. But it is also really interesting to remember that these numbers are just really high for everybody. And that is what should be the most disturbing thing of all. But of course, Donald Trump doing an extra good job of catalyzing and coalescing those racist beliefs.
The numbers, not surprising at all. The Hillary numbers, not surprising at all.
Yeah.
None of this surprises me. I just wish we had Bernie as part of this.
Yes.
As part of this poll.
I thought about that, Rachel. And also, a lot of people emailed me and they said, yeah, this is just so obvious. Well, yeah, it may be obvious, but if you mention it without data, the Trump defenders will say, well, what are you basing that view on, that Trump supporters harbor more racist views about black people? So it's important to have data to back up assertions, isn't it?
Definitely. And then everyone who is in alignment with him wanting to build walls and calling out a Mexican judge and additionally saying that we should ban Muslims really can now have the data to say, yeah, that's all true.
Fox News covered Elizabeth Warren's campaign rally with presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. Super important and interesting speech. There were implications in terms of the relationship between Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton, which has been, according to some, sort of rocky throughout the Democratic primary. They talked about what their path forward is going to be as far as angles on attacking Donald Trump. So Fox News covers the story. They bring on Pat Caddell, introduced as a former Democratic pollster. And immediately, they go to the most important issue from that rally, the color of the clothing that Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton wore during the rally. Take a look.
Donald Trump says he'll make America great again. It's right there. No, it's stamped on the front of his goofy hat. You want to see Goofy? Look at him in that hat.
All right, Democratic Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren taking a swipe at Trump today while stomping with Hillary Clinton in the swing state of Ohio, the darling of the progressive wing. She is said to be on Clinton's list of potential VP picks. Former Democratic pollster Pat Caddell joins us right now. Pat, does that help or does that hurt Hillary Clinton if Elizabeth is the running mate?
Well, it's an interesting question, but I have to comment first of all on the coordinate. I mean, the obviously twin outfits.
Yeah.
This is not good. Men don't have to do this. But so if they ran, they literally would have to have daily coordination.
Well, you know, now that you bring it up, I kind of wondered. Right? I mean, don't
Somebody
they have
should have said,
something,
wait a minute.
in the car that they could change
Yes,
into?
they do.
Elizabeth Warren could have probably said, I'll wear red
but
today.
somebody didn't do that because it makes a difference. You go, wait.
Oh, yeah. Right. Fascinating questions about the politics here. But right before I get into that, I just have to comment about the clothing worn by these two women. Even in 2016, record number of women holding office, the first female major party presidential nominee. Fox goes to looks. How dare they, Lewis, wear different shades of blue on the same stage?
It is not the most important thing to discuss.
No.
But I will say this. They probably should have realized that at least people would talk about it.
In other words, they should have predicted that because this type of thing still matters on channels like Fox News, they should have prevented that by wearing drastically different shades.
They have a lot on their minds. Their people maybe should have said, maybe we need to be. I mean, everything is controlled down to the smallest detail in a campaign, a presidential campaign, nevertheless.
Well, Rachel, last time that two male politicians showed up on stage wearing the same color suit, it was just crazy. I mean, you could not get Bill O'Reilly to stop talking about it. In fact, here's a picture of a Republican presidential debate from this campaign. And, other than the lighting differences, it looks like every single one of these stunning gentlemen dressed exactly the same. And there was except for the ties, no mention of it. So isn't this, I am one of these people who says we should not call sexism, we should not call racism, et cetera, when it doesn't exist, because then it weakens our position when it does exist. This is a very cut and dry difference. This is never mentioned when it's male politicians.
Oh, of course, it never is. And I do think that, that shade of blue is kind of known to be great for being on camera and being on television. I am a little bit surprised that they didn't coordinate it to wear something different. However, I really think it is absolutely unnecessary to comment on it because it does not affect anything that they are saying or doing. And I'm disappointed in you, Fox.
It's never discussed when men wear the same thing, which I almost always do in situations like this. I'm going to put this picture up again. Oh, no, that's not the picture. Excuse me. I'm going to put it up again. Had one of these men wore a suit that was not black.
Right.
If it was tan, remember the
these may be navy also. We don't, black or navy, yeah.
There wasn't black or navy. If someone wore a tan suit, a beige suit, a brown suit, a red suit, then people would talk about it.
I think you're talking about when Obama wore that tan suit.
People went crazy.
Right-wingers went crazy, saying it was a disrespectful suit to wear when there was serious conversation. I would argue that would not have happened to George W. Bush. I think that was because it was Obama, not because it was... I think that actually proves that the obsession over the clothing only exists in certain scenarios, and no one would have criticized George W. Bush, not Fox News anyway, for wearing the tan suit. It was because it was Obama.
He would have looked terrible in a tan suit. Obama pulled it off, but you're probably right.
We have a voicemail number. The number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Take a listen to this. Call anytime.
Hey, David. Hey, Louis. I love your show. I just have a suggestion for the both of you. Every time you guys bring up the topic about the regressive left and American leftists,
yeah,
I think you need to explain that the left in America are pretty much centrist or center-left at most internationally, because of the American spectrum being shifted all the way to the right. Just thought...
Absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you're completely right, and we should mention that more often, that the U.S. big picture, although it is moving to the left, it is far to the right of many European countries, and what we consider sort of center-left or left here would be relatively moderate in many other countries. Great bonus show today. We will talk about my hometown zoo is shutting down and much, much more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.